The rest of the England players broadly seem like maybe they're happy with the Ashes deal in that they've negotiated this thing with Queensland where they'll have the sort of resort quarantine that we have talked about in the previous couple of weeks. They'll be able to get out to train for a few hours a day, so it won't be staring at the hotel room wall for 2 weeks. The partners and kids will get the same treatment as long as they come out at around the same time. But that means they have to start in Queensland. That's where they've got this arrangement, which is interesting given that New South Wales are trialling 7-day home quarantine for vaccinated people by October, I think. So, there would be a chance, you'd imagine, for England players coming in at the end of November or even early December that, if they were coming into New South Wales or maybe Victoria by that point, it might be easier to come into the country still. But look, maybe things will be a bit more relaxed in Queensland by then, beyond what they're expecting at this point. But they've at least worked out something that is acceptable by today's standards, with today's vax rates and infection rates and all of that, that will be carried forward to when they arrive.
Yeah, I think the fact that there's been a lot of information relayed to the England team in the last 3 or 4 days has helped the situation. I mean, it was a fairly clear message coming out of the England team that they were so anxious because they had no clue what was going to happen to them. Resort quarantine, the fact that their families will get that when they arrive, be it with the team or later on, is all going to be part of this. I'm not sure. Well, I'm certain that Boris Johnson's conversation with Scott Morrison was obviously done to be able to say it was done. It was never going to achieve anything, but it has had the effect of getting it more on the news list of or the front of the paper rather than the back of the paper, shall we say, through the middle part of last week. And there was a story from Nick Holt in the Telegraph on Friday saying that we're on the cusp of mass withdrawals, and it feels like the weekend that's been disaster averted because of the quarantine arrangements. However, it doesn't fix the timing problem that we went through in great depth the other week, whereby families are going to be coming out much later, who have school-age kids will be coming out much later, and they still won't get to see, the families will not be together. I know that there's now figures like Michael Vaughan saying that they should just make a collective decision to do it and go ahead and get on with it. And I get where he's coming from with that, because the longer this drags out, the more uncertainty there is, the harder it is to kind of stick the landing and all the rest of it. But I still think that when you fold into this the conversation around the Perth Test match, so the fact that Perth is so locked up and so boarded up, people in England still get to see the pictures of people at the Shrine of Remembrance on the Westgate Bridge. There's a feeling over here, justified or otherwise, and let's say it's unjustified based on the vaccine rate, that there are a shitload of anti-vaxxers out here in Australia who are going to jeopardise the whole fucking thing. And I get that. They see the news. I mean, the forecasts are quite positive, but forecasts are one thing. What they can see with their own eyes is another. And the fact that Perth is considered to be a dungeon of sorts when it comes to getting in or getting out, and will remain that way till February. And we saw during the week Christina Matthews saying that the Ashes need to get to Perth before Melbourne and Sydney, which to me, Jeff, felt like after the grand final and the success of the grand final on the weekend, a fairly sort of brazen attempt to get the Boxing Day Test match. And again, I hate the state-by-state parochial shit.
Direct. I mean, that was explicit. She specifically said, we've had the AFL Grand Final, so why shouldn't we have the Boxing Day Test? I will make the point that everybody who went to Perth for the AFL Grand Final to work on it, to make it happen, all of the media, all of the AFL management and so on, had to do 2 weeks in hotel quarantine.
Yep. It
is not sustainable to ask people coming into your state to do that coming from other states if you want to put an event on. That doesn't mean you deserve to put an event on. That means you don't. That means it should be somewhere that's more manageable. All of these England players have to do 2 weeks coming into the country. Okay, fine. That's one thing. But to expect them to do it again to get into Perth is lunacy. And, I mean, it's likely to happen. With a handful of cases in Queensland now, what's the bet that within a couple of days the WA border shuts to Queensland, which it hasn't been before now. So I think WA has all but written themselves out of it, just as they did last summer, and can't really be sore about that because it's going to be too difficult, whereas there will be some ability to move by then between Melbourne, Sydney, Adelaide, and look, if Brisbane find themselves in the same boat over the next few weeks, then they'll be in that general pool as well.
Yeah, well, the problem is that the forecasts have Queensland getting to the magic number of 80% too late to make this work. The whole thing, and we're getting in the weeds a bit here, but based on Dan Brettig's reporting in the Age, the CA are unwilling to budge on the schedule. Like the schedule as it's been announced is the one thing they won't pivot on. I mean, we went through in great depth a couple of weeks ago. If they move it back a couple of weeks or 3 weeks and they started in Melbourne or started in Sydney, they can pull this off. But they won't, because, people can't be fucked thinking outside the square on this stuff. And the schedule's a schedule, and we'd have to resell ads, and it competes against the tennis and all that sort of shit. But if it means getting everyone in and getting the whole thing on the road a little bit later, just to buy some precious time. And having the Brisbane test, and which, by the way, it's not cricket's fault. You said before that WA's made a decision to behave in this way and take these government decisions. It's also not the fault of the sport that the vaccine rates are lower in some states compared to others. I mean, at the end of the day, cricket can't be held hostage to the fact that Queensland's going to get to 80% a month and a half after New South Wales. That's not cricket's fault.
And it's not the WACA's fault that their state government will make it difficult for people to get into the state, even when they're extremely low-risk people, and there could be some sort of accommodation worked out that maintains the health system while, not derailing the entire competition. But there's basically no way out of this, because if you want to bring the Perth Test earlier, as they're suggesting, it can't be the first test because all the players are arriving in Queensland. So presumably, if there's difficulty getting from Queensland to Perth, it'll still exist. So if you make it the second test, that doesn't guarantee that those players will be able to get from Queensland to Perth, because that border could be closed by then. And you can't make it the third test because that's Boxing Day, and we will presumably be able to have people at the MCG in Melbourne, vaccinated people attending that game by the 26th of December. So it's not going to be Boxing Day and it's not going to be New Year's. Those two things aren't going to move. The only thing it could be would be the first or the second. Can't be the second because of the likelihood or the possibility of the border closing. Can't be the first because of where they're arriving. So there's just no way around it unless the WA government were willing to be a little bit more accommodating to try to help the thing go ahead. Yeah,
it should be the first. If they're going to stick to the schedule, Perth should... I mean, again, it's like rewarding bad behaviour, isn't it? But you almost got to make it the first, and the WA government have to give them the same arrangements as Queensland. But it's not going to happen, is it? It's a moot point. Which they won't. Exactly, they won't. So it's all ending up in a scenario where Perth miss out on an Ashes test, and it goes, according to reports, to Monica or Hobart. And you know what? They would both do a stellar job. The experience, Jeff, we had in Canberra a couple of years ago was first class at a wonderful venue. They put on a great show. Every time we've been there, Jeff, for international cricket, they've done a stellar job. And the same applies to Bellerive, who get a bad rap from people who don't like how close it is to Antarctica and stuff like that. And, when playing test matches in November, whilst that might be true, that it can be chilly there, it's not a concern in January, which is when
let
it would
have
be.
the fifth test. Let it be in
the
middle of January. That's the one time. That's the time you want to be down there.
That's the time. And it also...
Have a test in Hobart there.
But also, I mean, it would be probably a once-in-a-lifetime occurrence, an Ashes test match in Hobart. They've never had one before. They would sell it out every day. So it's not going to be like when the Windies were here in 2015, their most recent test match.
It was 6 degrees when play started in the morning, and it was the start of November. Yeah, I mean, it was...
It was just Paul. It was never going to happen, right? They were never going to get great crowds to that, whereas this they can. So if we end up in Hobart or we end up in Canberra, so be it, if that's what it takes.